In the fading memory of the Bronze Age, after the light of the Minoans dimmed on the island of Crete, a new power arose from the Greek mainland. They did not come with hands stained by art, nor did they bring frescoes of dolphins dancing on the waves. They came with sword and spear, with massive stone walls, and with an unquenchable thirst for conquest. These were the Mycenaeans, the first warriors who laid the foundations of classical Greece. The Mycenaeans lived in towering stone fortresses, built with blocks so immense that later generations believed only the Cyclopes could have raised them. Within those citadels resided powerful kings, bronze-armored warriors, and golden treasures still gleaming through the dust of time. They entered history through immortal epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, where names like Agamemnon, Achilles, and Odysseus became eternal. Yet, like every civilization, the Mycenaeans could not escape the cycle of rise and fall. From the glory of the Trojan War to the shadows of the Greek Dark Age, their story was one of fire, gold, and tragedy. Tonight, let us pass through the stone gates of Mycenae, descend into the beehive-shaped tombs, and hear the echoes of lost warriors. This is the tale of the Mycenaean civilization, the first warrior society of Europe. Part 1. The Origins of the Mycenaeans. When the brilliance of the Minoans faded beneath the ash of Santorini and the march of invaders, a new people quietly stepped into the light from the Greek mainland. They were not like the Cretans, lovers of art who praised dolphins and lilies. They were warriors. They lived in stone fortresses, carried bronze swords at their sides, and believed true power came not from the gentle sea, but from the edge of the blade. These were the Mycenaeans, ancestors of Greek heroes and the first foundation of classical Greece. Their beginnings lay around 1600 BCE, on the rugged mainland of Greece. Narrow valleys, hemmed in by mountains and a jagged coastline, forged a hardy people. Unlike fertile Crete with its open seas, the mainland was harsher, producing small defensive communities where survival demanded strength. From this landscape was born the Mycenaean warrior spirit. The heart of their world was Mycenae, a fortified hill city in the Peloponnese whose name came to define the entire civilization. Other centers included Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, Orchomenos, and even early Athens. Each had massive walls, palaces, and royal tombs. These were not mere villages, but palace fortresses, symbols of a society where power was rooted in war. Most striking were the Cyclopean walls. Built of enormous stones fitted without mortar, they were so colossal that the Greeks later believed the one-eyed Cyclopes had raised them. At the Lion Gate of Mycenae, with its two carved lions flanking a sacred pillar, one feels the awe and authority the Mycenaeans sought to project. For them, the fortress itself was the emblem of power. The Mycenaeans were also the first to use Linear B, a script adapted from Minoan Linear A and successfully deciphered in modern times. These tablets reveal meticulous records of grain, livestock, tribute, and social hierarchy. They show that the Mycenaeans were not wild warriors, but an organized society with administration and bureaucracy. At the top stood the Wanax, the king, supreme political, military, and religious leader. Below him were nobles, warrior aristocrats, priests, then farmers and slaves. Unlike the Minoans, whose religion often placed women at the center, the Mycenaean world was patriarchal and militarized. Power rested firmly with men, and war defined society. Their art reflects this contrast. A Minoan vase shows flowers, fish, and dolphins. A Mycenaean vase shows warriors, chariots, and weapons. The famous Mask of Agamemnon, a golden funerary mask from Mycenae, embodies their obsession with power, death, and war. Still, the Mycenaeans borrowed much from the Minoans. palatial architecture, writing, even elements of religion. But while the Minoans were artists of the sea, the Mycenaeans transformed these influences into tools of a warrior society. In a sense, they Hellenized Minoan traditions, forging the cultural bedrock of Greece. Their origins were not peaceful. They were born in fire, raised with swords, and expanded through conquest. If the Minoans represented softness and the feminine, the Mycenaeans embodied hardness and the masculine. Two opposite worlds, and when one fell, the other rose. From 1600 to 1400 BCE, the Mycenaeans grew in strength. Their fortified citadels dominated the landscape. Their wealth filled monumental Tholos tombs with gold and weapons. Their administration recorded every detail in clay tablets. By the mid-15th century BCE, they had taken Knossos itself, extending their reach across Crete. The age of the Mycenaeans had begun, an age of warriors, conquests, and legends destined to be immortalized in epic. Standing atop the walls of Mycenae at sunset, gazing over the Argolid plain and the distant Aegean, one can understand why the Mycenaeans became warriors. A harsh land bred resilience, and that resilience forged a civilization unlike any other, the first warrior civilization of Europe and the seedbed of Greek myth. Part 2. The Golden Age, Warrior Society and Culture. As the shadow of the Minoans faded on Crete, a new light blazed from the Greek mainland. From the 15th to the 13th century BCE, the Mycenaeans entered their Golden Age, an era when colossal fortresses rose, golden tombs crowned the hillsides, and immortal legends began to take shape. This was the time when the Mycenaeans became Europe's first true warrior civilization. Picture a day in Mycenae around 1300 BCE. You approach the Lion Gate, their most famous entrance. Two stone lions stand guard, their heads once crafted of precious metal, now lost to time. Passing through the heavy gates, you enter a citadel encircled by walls of stone, each block weighing many tons, fitted so tightly no blade could slip between them. Later, Greeks called them the Cyclopean walls, for only giants, they thought, could have built them. The atmosphere is not festive like Crete, but solemn, imposing, a reminder that this was a society of warriors. At the center stood the palace of the Wanax, the supreme king. Unlike Knossos, with its frescoes of dolphins, this palace was austere, a throne room, a great hearth, storerooms filled with grain and oil. Clay tablets inscribed in Linear B record every jar of olive oil, every head of cattle, every slave, proof of a tightly controlled bureaucracy. Everything served the king and his warrior elite. Mycenaean society was sharply stratified. At the top stood the Wanax, beneath him the Lauagetas, often translated as leader of the people, perhaps a general or deputy king. Below them were officials managing land, taxes, storage, and religion. Warrior nobles held great status, for military power was the foundation of rule. At the base were artisans, farmers, and slaves. This was a militarized bureaucratic society, organized around the king, war, and the economy of war. Their art reflects this ethos. Where Minoan pottery shows dolphins and lilies, Mycenaean pottery shows warriors, chariots, and weapons. They buried their dead with gold masks, silver-inlaid swords, and ivory ornaments. In shaft graves at Mycenae, archaeologists uncovered treasures of immense wealth, proof of both their prosperity and their desire for immortality. The most famous find is the so-called Mask of Agamemnon, unearthed by Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century. Though later dated earlier than Homer's legendary king, the name endures. To gaze upon its golden face is to glimpse the Mycenaean spirit, a culture obsessed with power, warrior kingship, and eternity. Architecture, too, bore their signature. Beyond the Cyclopean walls, the Mycenaeans built monumental tholos tombs, beehive-shaped chambers carved into hillsides for their rulers. The treasury of Atreus, also known as the tomb of Agamemnon, soars 13 meters high with a diameter of 14 meters, constructed entirely of cut stone blocks. To enter it is to step into a prehistoric cathedral of stone where power was enshrined in sheer scale. Religion, inherited from the Minoans, shifted toward male gods and war. Linear B tablets mention Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, Artemis, deities who would later anchor Greek mythology. Yet Poseidon appears most often, perhaps reflecting the sea and earthquakes that shaped Mycenaean life. Rituals included animal sacrifice, and perhaps even human sacrifice, to appease their gods. Daily life was agricultural but always tied to war. They grew barley, olives, grapes, and raised livestock. Yet much of the produce was stored in palace granaries to feed armies and sustain campaigns. Craftsmen forged weapons, armor, and chariots. Farmers labored for tribute. Slaves served the elite. In Mycenaean society, war was not an occasional event. It was the rhythm of life. And yet, their golden age was undeniably brilliant. They built mighty fortresses and palaces, created golden art, and maintained a sophisticated bureaucracy. They were not nameless warriors, but builders of a civilization whose impact echoed through history. From this period, the seeds of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were sown, stories of kings, warriors, and endless battles. The Mycenaean Golden Age was a world of gold and blood, gold in the tombs, blood on the battlefields. A world where wealth and art served power and war. A world less gentle than the Minoans, but fierce, unyielding, and destined to leave a lasting legacy. Part 3. War, Trade, and Mediterranean Influence. If one image could define the Mycenaeans, it would be that of a warrior aboard a sailing ship, one hand gripping a sword, the other on the helm. They were both land fighters and seasoned sailors, and above all, seekers of power through commerce and conquest. This dual identity made the Mycenaeans a dominant force in the Mediterranean at the twilight of the Bronze Age. Voyages of the warrior merchants. Imagine a morning at the port of Pylos. Dozens of ships prepare to set sail. Mycenaean vessels were not as massive as later Roman warships, but strong enough to cross the Aegean, carrying goods, weapons, and soldiers. On deck stand warriors clad in gleaming bronze armor, boar-tusk helmets, and large round shields. They were not mere traders. They were ready to fight at any moment. This was the essence of the Mycenaean identity, merchant warriors. They sailed to Crete, now under their rule, to Cyprus, rich in copper for weapon making, to the Anatolian coast, to Egypt, even as far as the Levant and Sicily. Archaeological evidence shows Mycenaean pottery scattered across the Mediterranean, from Turkey to Israel, from Italy to Egypt. Their trade networks were vast, but commerce always moved hand in hand with military might. War, the soul of the Mycenaeans. Unlike the Minoans, Mycenaean art was filled with images of war. Pottery depicted chariot lines, marching soldiers, and armed ships. Clay tablets in Linear B listed weapons, armor, and troop numbers, showing how thoroughly the state organized its military. They wielded long bronze swords, heavy round shields, helmets crafted from dozens of boar tusks. Above all, they mastered the chariot, the ultimate weapon of the Bronze Age, both a tool of war and a symbol of power. In royal tombs, carvings and grave goods depicted chariots in battle and in ritual. The Mycenaeans were not content with defense. They conquered. They expanded across the Peloponnese, dominated the Aegean islands, and likely pressured Egypt and the Hittite Empire. Egyptian and Hittite texts speak of a people called the Ahiyawa, believed by many scholars to be the Mycenaeans, the ancestors of Homer's Achaeans. If so, they stood as equals to the great empires of their age, Egypt, the Hittites, and Babylon. Troy, War and Legend. No tale of the Mycenaeans is complete without the Trojan War. Though Homer's Iliad blends myth with history, many archaeologists believe it reflects real conflict. At Hisarlik, ancient Troy, excavations reveal a city destroyed around the 12th century BCE, precisely when Mycenae was at its height. Legend says King Agamemnon of Mycenae led a Greek coalition against Troy for 10 years. Names like Achilles, Odysseus, Hector, Paris, and Helen became immortal, whether embellished or not. The Trojan War likely echoes an actual struggle between the Mycenaeans and Anatolian states, perhaps over control of the Hellespont trade routes. If true, then the Mycenaeans were not just warriors, but the architects of the most famous war in ancient memory. Expanding influence, their strength lay not only in arms, but in cultural influence. They adapted the Minoan script into Linear B, used to record early Greek. This proves that the Greek language itself has Mycenaean roots, making them the direct ancestors of classical Greece. Their Cyclopean fortresses and tholos tombs became architectural models. Cities like Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes all bore their imprint. Mycenaean pottery spread across the Mediterranean, and their myths of warrior kings and heroes endured through oral tradition, later crystallized in Homer's epics. The warrior's golden age, by the 13th century BCE, the Mycenaeans reached their zenith. Mighty fortresses, golden tombs, bustling trade, and the Trojan War defined them as a formidable civilization. Yet, behind every peak lies a shadow. New enemies emerged, nature grew restless, and fragile trade networks began to crumble. Thus, the golden age of the Mycenaeans was both a triumph and a foreshadowing of fate. They planted the seeds of classical Greece, but also set themselves on the path to destruction. Part 4. Collapse into darkness. The Bronze Age. Collapse. No glory lasts forever. Not even the mighty Cyclopean walls could withstand the harsh hand of time and chaos. Around the 12th century BCE, while Mycenaean fortresses still towered proudly and tombs still brimmed with gold and silver, invisible cracks had already begun to spread through their foundations. And then, in just a few decades, a once mighty civilization collapsed, vanishing into the darkness of history. The Mediterranean in turmoil. By the late 13th century BCE, the entire eastern Mediterranean descended into unprecedented chaos, a catastrophe historians now call the Bronze Age collapse. It was not only the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, Ugarit, and even Egypt were caught in the storm. The causes remain a mystery, but scholars point to a deadly chain of factors. Earthquakes. Greece, scarred with fault lines, saw many cities toppled by seismic waves. Crop failure and famine. Climate shifts, perhaps triggered by volcanic eruptions or global weather disruptions, led to agricultural collapse. Civil unrest, growing inequality bred resentment among peasants and slaves. Invasions, the Sea Peoples, mysterious seafaring raiders, recorded in Egyptian inscriptions, ravaged the Mediterranean world. Together, these forces created the perfect storm. The fall of the fortresses archaeology reveals that around 1200 BCE, Mycenaean cities burned one after another. Pylos, the palace of King Nestor, was reduced to ash. Tiryns, Thebes, Orchomenos all bore scars of fire. Even mighty Mycenae itself fell silent in ruin. In the palace at Pylos, clay tablets of Linear B were baked hard by the flames, preserving their final words: inventories of weapons, lists of soldiers, warnings of enemies from the sea. The once impregnable fortresses had been breached. Evidence shows violent assaults and infernos consuming entire palaces. Who were the destroyers? Perhaps the sea peoples, marauders from the waves. Perhaps the Dorians, Greek tribes invading from the north. Or perhaps uprisings from within. Whoever they were, the result was the same. Fire swallowed the Mycenaean world. The collapse of trade. The Mycenaeans thrived on trade and tribute, but when the seas became unsafe, when Cyprus, Ugarit, and the Hittite Empire fell, their lifelines snapped. No more copper, ivory, or luxury goods. A society built on centralized palatial economies unraveled. Craftsmen lost their work, merchants their markets, farmers their overlords. The intricate structure of Mycenaean society crumbled into fragments. The Dark Ages, by around 1100 BCE, most Mycenaean palaces lay abandoned. Linear B vanished. Writing itself, once their pride, was forgotten. Greece entered what historians call the Greek Dark Ages. For over 4 centuries there were no great buildings, no centralized states, no writing. People lived in small villages, surviving by subsistence, but darkness was not the end. Memories of Mycenaean kings and warriors endured in oral tradition. Passed from generation to generation, these memories transformed into myth and epic. By the 8th century BCE, with writing reborn, Homer gave them eternal life in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Tragedy and fragility. The fall of the Mycenaeans reveals the fragility of civilization. They had vast walls, mighty armies, glittering treasures, yet a few earthquakes, a few years of famine, a few invasions, and all was undone. A civilization may endure for centuries, yet vanish within a single lifetime. Later, Greeks looked back on the Mycenaeans with awe and sorrow. They called it the Age of Heroes, a time when men were stronger, greater. But beneath the legend lay suffering, a brilliant civilization swallowed by oblivion. Thus, from the glory of Troy to the shadows of the Dark Ages, the Mycenaeans closed their chapter, a chapter both magnificent and tragic, yet one that laid the very foundations of classical Greece. Part 5. Legacy. From legend to history. A civilization may fall, but its memory never dies. When the walls of Mycenae had crumbled, when the palace of Pylos was reduced to ashes, the spirit of the Mycenaeans still lived on in the memory of later Greeks. They survived in stories, in legends, and eventually became the very foundation of classical Greece. This is the immortal legacy of the Mycenaeans. Heroes turned into myth. In the 8th century BCE, Homer composed the Iliad and the Odyssey. Though he lived more than 4 centuries after the Mycenaean age, his epics echoed the collective memory of heroic ancestors. Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, Hector, Helen, these characters stand within the Trojan War, but behind them lies the memory of Mycenaean times. In the Iliad, warriors wear boar tusk helmets, wield long bronze swords, and ride chariots, exactly as found in Mycenaean tombs. In the Odyssey, kings rule from palaces with storerooms and retainers, mirroring the palatial society of the Mycenaeans. Though mythologized, Homer's epics became the bridge connecting the Mycenaean world to classical Greece, from legend to archaeology. For centuries, Mycenaean Greece was thought to be mere legend. That changed in the 19th century, when Heinrich Schliemann, a German amateur archaeologist, set out to prove Homer's tales. He dug at Hisarlik, modern-day Turkey, and claimed to find Troy. Then he turned to Mycenae, unearthing royal shaft graves filled with gold. Upon seeing a golden mask, he declared, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." Though Schliemann was often romantic and reckless, his discoveries proved that the Mycenaeans were not myth, but a real civilization, with fortresses, palaces, writing, and wealth. From then on, Mycenae stood not just in legend, but firmly in history. Language and writing. Another vital legacy is language. The decipherment of Linear B in the 20th century revealed it as the earliest form of Greek. This proved the Mycenaeans were the first Greeks, direct ancestors of the classical world. Words like wanax, king, lauagetas, leader, and even the names of gods, Zeus, Poseidon, appear in these tablets. Thanks to this, we now know that classical Greece did not arise suddenly, but grew from Mycenaean roots. Architecture and art, Cyclopean walls, the Lion Gate, Tholos tombs, all still stand today. Modern visitors who pass beneath the Lion Gate at Mycenae can still feel the cold grandeur of stone, imagining the warriors who once walked there. Mycenaean art, from golden masks to warrior-painted pottery, still tells of a society steeped in war, yet drenched in wealth. These ruins are not just stone and metal. They are history carved into the earth. Lessons of collapse. The legacy of the Mycenaeans is not only their glory, but also their warning. They show how even the strongest civilization can fall to disaster, to war, to internal strife. Yet they also show how memory can outlast ruin. Even in the Dark Ages, the Greeks preserved tales of heroic ancestors, transforming them into myth and culture. Immortality through epic. Without Homer, the Mycenaeans might have remained only cold ruins, but through the Iliad and the Odyssey, they became immortal. When we read of Troy, of Odysseus at sea, of Agamemnon and Achilles, we are reading the echoes of the Mycenaean age. Their greatest legacy is to have become the cradle of Greek mythology and, through it, the cornerstone of Western civilization. The legacy continues. Today, when we look back at the Mycenaeans, we see not just a warrior society that collapsed, but the seed of philosophy, art, literature, and politics that followed. They laid the first stones for classical Greece, for Athens and Sparta, for Socrates and Plato, for the very ideas of democracy and freedom we still inherit. The true legacy of the Mycenaeans is not the broken walls or the gold in their graves. It is the memory of a heroic age, an age where men lived and died by the sword, leaving behind stories that endured for millennia. And so, we have walked the full arc of the Mycenaean story, from their origins in the shadow of the Minoans, to the peak of warrior merchants, to collapse in the fires of the Bronze Age, and finally, to their eternal afterlife in Greek myth. What makes them special is not only their fortresses or treasures, but the way they live on in human memory. Though fallen for over 3,000 years, through Homer's verses, they remain with us. In every tale of Agamemnon, Achilles, and Odysseus, the Cyclopean walls may crumble, the Linear B tablets may turn to ash, but collective memory never fades. That memory became the seed of classical Greece, the cradle of philosophy, art, and the Western mind. Without the Mycenaeans, there would be no Homer. Without Homer, no Greece. Without Greece, the West would not be what it is today. Thus, the Mycenaeans did not die. They transformed into legend, and legend, unlike stone, can live forever.